These next few presentations, I just want to make sure we're all on the same page, and I'm going to gear it as much to bioprinting and biofabrication as possible. The very first topic, of course, being an introduction to additive manufacturing in medicine. So we all kind of are familiar, I hope, with the basic paradigm that in additive manufacturing, we start at some point here with a 3D CAD model, whether that's from a micro CT scan of something that we want to replicate, or it's just a CAD model that we generate on our own. And then through some fabrication process, we slice that or create images. We're going to talk more about that step later. And you 3D print that. So you don't always get exactly the same structure as your CAD model, which is important for us to keep in mind later. But of course, 3D printing here, we are adding these materials layer by layer, hence the name additive manufacturing. And there's several different applications which people are using additive manufacturing in medicine right now. And the first, most kind of basic one, it starts with surgical pre-planning models along with surgical templates. So we can start with the most basic 3D modeling and printing application in medicine, where we get a CT scan of a patient, and then we're able to simply 3D print that, so that way surgeons are able to use that for planning the procedure. Custom designed prosthetics and implants suited for individual patients come next. They're a little more complicated. You're still generally working with simpler materials. And after that, we can make things a little more complicated by getting into 3D tissue culture models for drug and therapy testing in vitro. This is developing tissue engineering applications using 3D printing, but without having to implant it in vivo. And then finally, the ultimate goal, which I think a lot of us are here to learn a little bit more about, is tissue engineering constructs complete with biodegradable materials, growth factors, and cells. So that's your artificial tissue and organ applications. We're going to break down each of those, and hopefully we have some lessons from each of these techniques that are useful for us, or things that we can start employing in the laboratory. So like I said, the most basic, and probably one of the ones that's actually getting the most clinical use today, is in surgical pre-planning. So I actually worked with these individuals here at Children's National Medical Center in Washington, D.C., and they ran the 3D printing center at the hospital. They started out printing these cardiac models of children born with congenital heart defects, which have, as you can see, intricate anatomies. Each child is born with a different defect, so you can't always know what you're getting yourself into unless you hold a 3D model. If we're looking at even a 3D micro CT scan, of course, you're limited to what you can see on the screen at a time. But when you have a model, you have the whole 3D, when you have a 3D printed model, you have the whole three-dimensional geometry and anatomical features that you get during surgery. So there's actually been a marked increase in improved surgical outcomes, both in a reduction of time and efficiency, increase in efficiency when using this kind of surgical pre-op planning. Probably one of the most complicated cases, one of the coolest cases, is when these individuals printed out the anatomy of conjoined twins and then used that model to figure out how they were going to separate those twins. So all this type of printing involves is taking these medical images, directly transporting to the printer, and printing those out. Probably the simplest but most elegant way that we can use 3D printing in medicine. If we get a little bit more complicated, we start getting into customized prosthetics. So working again with this same lab, as a brief overview, we are able to take the anatomical image of a defect in a child with a congenital heart defect. We can customize the graft to perfectly fit both the fluid flow and the geometry of that child, and then check to make sure that this model fits our three-dimensional model before we 3D print that into a customized prosthetic. Again, we're working with just one material, but now we've gone a step further than surgical pre-planning, where we actually design the model instead of just 3D print something that we've taken from an image. And if we want to move a step beyond that, Organovo, for instance, is popularizing using 3D printing for drug screening. So they've published several papers, and you'll see papers from other laboratories outside of the commercial realm that you can better replicate the effects of drugs and side effects on drugs on a three-dimensional construct, especially organoids, instead of just using cell culture monolayers that are kind of the paradigm in most pharmaceutical testing. So as we get more complicated, even just printing out a mass of cells inside of a hydrogel that replicates that organoid provides us much more efficient results. So that is something that we will talk about today and something that is probably employed in several people's research here. Finally, of course, the holy grail of tissue engineering and biofabrication is taking a defect that we get from a medical image, design a 3D printed model based on that defect, something that'll fit perfectly customized for that patient, and then using a combination of biomaterials and cells, we can replicate the geometry, the biology, and the function of that tissue, print it, and implant it. So this field has taken off in the past few years, which makes courses like this hopefully more relevant. We've seen a drastic increase in the number of publications and journals, actually, that are geared towards 3D printing. So the resources are definitely increasing for this field. And it's not just a matter of academic research, but the field itself, as far as healthcare, biomaterials in 3D printing, is projected to increase drastically over the next few years. So we want to get involved in these type of things early because we have several different benefits of 3D printing and additive manufacturing. The first, of course, is personalization and customization of these devices. So if I go back to the example of the children born with congenital heart disease, right now these children are using devices that are designed for adults. So if you're throwing a vascular graft in there for a child, obviously you've got kind of compliance mismatch. You don't have the growth that you'd experience with a biomaterial. Several different limitations like that, and now all of a sudden with 3D printing, of course, we can customize an implant for that child, or as you saw in that last slide with the tissue engineered craniofacial defect. There is increased cost efficiency when we can directly manufacture something rather than have to go about indirect manufacturing, especially when we're talking about something like as expensive as biomaterials and cells. It makes a lot of sense if we're doing these customized defects to directly manufacture that if possible. And of course, if we're not, even when we're not using tissue engineering, the rapid product development, the iteration speed that we can get with 3D printing is a fantastic way to increase and expedite our research in the lab, especially if we're working on things like surgical tools or surgical guides. This has made manufacturing accessible to a variety of individuals, and we work with printers in the range of a couple $100s to hundreds of thousands of dollars, but you don't have to spend that much money to get involved in an open source project either. So really, there's a number of different ways that we can kind of democratize 3D printing for biofabrication. We get better recapitulation of the tissues too that we're trying to model if we can more accurately manufacture these grafts and medical devices, not just on the macro scale, but one thing that's very important that we're going to talk about in a lot of our research is on the micro scale as well, to show what's going on in the cellular environment, especially in that extracellular, complex extracellular matrix environment. There are a ton of different challenges and considerations, though, when using 3D printing. I know we've probably run into people who think that we can easily 3D print an organ in the lab and we have a heart the next day. And of course, if you're familiar with the field, you know that we're a long way from getting to that point. There are many smaller steps that we have to follow. So we're going to get more into this as we go into the next presentations. But very briefly, we have to make sure that when we are deciding whether or not we actually want to use biofabrication processes to employ it in our research, that it is applicable, that it will be helpful, and it won't just slog down our research, and it's not just using 3D printing because 3D printing sounds cool in paper title. In this case, we have a variety of concerns with materials, which we'll definitely talk about more later. We have, of course, the tissues and cellular considerations, and not just tissues and cells, but even something as simple as trying to incorporate growth factors and drugs into our 3D printed model become drastically more complicated depending on which technique in 3D printing that you're hoping to work with. The printing process itself, you'll see there's no perfect printing process, and so what I'm hoping to do today is we can talk about things like resolution, as well as size limitations, challenges in translating our computer models to the 3D printer itself, and some of the considerations when we're talking about layer by layer fabrication and how that affects the homogeneity of our 3D printed tissues or prototypes. So again, as we go from some of those topics that we introduced earlier, our concerns and challenges drastically increase. So it's very easy to jump into 3D printing and use something for surgical pre-planning when you're really only concerned about resolution as well as speed of your print and potentially, the feel of the materials themselves, things like stiffness, mechanical properties to give the surgeons or clinicians a better idea of what they're facing. But when you get all the way into implantable tissues, which is really what we're going to gear a lot of our research and our presentations today, you get into a myriad of challenges. And again, each of these challenges is going to be drastically different based off the materials you use, as well as the 3D printing technique that you want to use. So it's really important that we consider all of these factors when deciding, like I said, whether or not we actually want to use biofabrication in our research. Material considerations themselves, of course, depend on what exactly you're trying to print. So like I said, it gets simple. If you're doing surgical pre-planning, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. Whereas if we go here to implantable tissues and even our organoids, we're looking at more complex tissues or materials that are more research-oriented, and each of those will have drastic impacts on what kind of 3D printing techniques we can use and what we really should be aiming for in this research. So to conclude here, additive manufacturing becomes more complex the more biological factors are taken into consideration. And while 3D printing offers us enormous customizability in form and function, we really need to consider whether or not it's actually applicable to our research. But still, with the increasing breadth of equipment and material design, with decreasing costs, we have a much easier time, hopefully, involving additive manufacturing in our healthcare. So that's one of the things that we're hoping to do at the Biomaterials Lab, is make it really easy to see if additive manufacturing is right for your research. And so like I said, again, this is just a little plug for us, but if there is one of these techniques that you're interested in and just trying it out for your research, please drop by and we can talk about it, as well as we can do test prints so you can see whether or not additive manufacturing is going to work out for you.